So we've been going through Lumen Gentium in season 3 of Generation Vatican II, which is kind of why I've asked you to come on here, because as I've been watching your show and listening to you talk, you have brought it up many times. So you also talk a lot about just the Second Vatican Council. So depending on how much time we have at the end here, we may get a little bit into just general Vatican II questions there. But in the meantime, hey, we're capping off season 3 with Lumen Gentium, so let's get into it. First off, I'd like to ask a rather broad question specifically about you. You actually first joined the Eastern Orthodox, one of the Eastern Orthodox churches, and then went from that to Catholicism. So I was wondering, why didn't you go to Eastern Catholicism instead of straight into the Latin Church?
What I had originally been Protestant, and then I went Catholic back in 2012. But in 2017, I had a detour in Eastern Orthodoxy for various reasons, which we can get into. But ultimately, I continued to study the issues, and the objective truth claims of the Catholic Church just continued to press against me, and I had to. I found myself at the position where I felt I really needed to be reconciled to Rome and re-enter back into full communion, which I did in 2019. So I think it was late 2019, somewhere around there. And you asked the question, well, why didn't I go the Eastern Catholic route? I probably would have if I had an Eastern Catholic parish available, but they're just too far away from me. The closest one is about 4 hours away, so it's just not very practical. So I just go to a Latin Rite parish.
Gotcha. And do you prefer the traditional Latin Mass or the Novus Ordo?
That's a good question. If we're talking about the traditional Latin Mass compared to your average Novus Ordo, traditional Latin Mass any day. Now, if we're talking about the Novus Ordo done properly, maybe like at St. John Cantius. I don't know if you're familiar with their parish, but they do the extraordinary form and the ordinary form in both of them very well. If you compare them, the two, the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo done properly, that's a tougher one. So I would say ultimately there's no major substantial differences there. So I wouldn't be upset to go to either, to be honest. But when it comes to what my preferences are, just as far as personal preferences, I really prefer the Byzantine liturgy over the Latin liturgy. Now, that wasn't always the case. I used to prefer the more Latin style liturgy, Latin Rite. But I don't know. The Byzantine liturgy just really grew on me when I took that detour to Orthodoxy, and it's always just stuck. So I guess I prefer, if we're just talking about preferences, Eastern.
Just like what appeals to you most?
Probably Byzantine liturgy.
Byzantine liturgy. Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Hey, there's no problem with that.
But it's a preference. I'd be happy to go to a traditional Latin Mass or a Novus Ordo that's done properly, or Eastern Rite parish.
Mm-hmm. So I'm familiar with John Cantius. For my parents have gone to it a couple times, so they know the name of it. But then I also had the opportunity to interview Austin Suggs. Shout out to Gospel Simplicity, who kind of like jumped into the foray of Catholicism by like accidentally going to John Cantius.
I heard about
which
that.
is a phenomenal opportunity to be like, oh, I'm just going to take a step into a Catholic church. Oh, what's this? This is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, lucky duck.
Right.
So that's how I'm familiar with it. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I got to visit them a few years ago, and I got to see how they did the extraordinary form and also the ordinary form, and they did both very well. I wouldn't mind going to either one of theirs.
Rock on.
Yeah.
So in my experience, I think I definitely prefer the Novus Ordo because, being a generic American, I find the Latin Rite to be very obtuse and obscure.
Yeah.
Obscure, not in like, oh, it's obscuring the mystery of God. No, like obscure, like I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And there's a big conversation that I plan on having with David Bates of Pints with Jack in a little bit. About actually, he's a mutual friend of ours.
Oh yeah.
So he and I were going to talk about the ability to like understand what's going on and the various rites coming up in the next month or so. So, yeah, like the ability to just understand what's going on, and the fact that like the Latin rite, the Latin form was the lingua franca of when it was developed, and then all the different churches are done more or less in the language of that place. Like I feel like, okay, you should be doing it in your vernacular, which for us would be English. So I just find it that much easier to, attend mass.
When I first converted to Catholicism, I definitely preferred the Novus Ordo for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not understand the traditional Latin Mass. And I thought it was a barrier. In fact, it was a barrier for me. I constantly asked the question, how could the church have this as its liturgy for so long? If I had lived 100 years ago, I would have to go to one of these if I were in the West. And I just can't reconcile that with what I, believe to be the proper form of worship. So for a while, I struggled with the traditional Latin Mass when I first converted. But I kind of worked through some issues. But I do see the importance of the vernacular to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
And I do see that there were some needs to reform certain liturgical practices and aspects. So I'm in favor of the liturgical reform. I think that some things could have been done better, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, okay, so let's get into some of the stuff we were talking about for Lumen Gentium. Like the ability to worship in your vernacular language. I feel like that is a necessary item in worshiping God, like because you need to understand what you're saying and what you're doing when you worship God. Contrast that with the standard FSSP or SSPX attendee. It seems like, if I could paint with too broad of a brushstroke, they almost fetishize the Latin language as being like extra holy, and I feel like that's not appropriate. No language on earth is any better to worship God than any other language, broadly speaking, because like human language doesn't have any, intrinsic quality that makes it better or worse to worship God in,
Yeah. Yeah, I think some people go a little too far with it. I understand the values of Latin. John the 23rd issued a document right before the Second Vatican Council, or was it 64, somewhere around there. It was right around that time. Issued a really good document on the importance of the Latin language, and I wholeheartedly affirm it. But I would also agree with you insofar as I think it's important that we worship in a language that we understand. Now, some might say, well, you could learn Latin. Okay, there are some things that maybe we can learn Latin. And in fact, I believe it was the Second Vatican Council or especially the liturgical reform after Vatican II, that emphasized the fact that, yeah, we're going to have the vernacular, but we should still know how to pray to our Father in Latin and certain things in Latin. So I kind of want to balance those out, but I completely get where you're where you're coming from when it comes to the importance of worshiping in a language that we understand. I also understand what they're trying to emphasize when it comes to the importance of having a universal language, but not at the expense of us understanding what's taking place in the liturgy and what's being said in the liturgy. So I kind of want to balance those out, but I lean in favor of having parts that are relevant to things that we're going to say in the liturgy. That should be mostly done in the vernacular. And I'm okay with occasional parts here and there being in Latin, especially some of the maybe silent prayers of the priest.